Dorian Vex was a man who had seen more violence than most could ever imagine. A former mercenary, he had spent years fighting in the roughest corners of the galaxy, where the only rule was survival. So when the offer came to protect the twin daughters of the Zarkari High Chancellor, it seemed like the kind of job any smart person would take. After all, the pay was beyond anything he had ever dreamed of, and a steady job was a rare thing for someone like him. What he didn't expect, however, was that the job would turn out to be far more dangerous and complicated than he could have ever guessed. The twins, Princess Lysara and Princess Vena, were daughters of the most powerful man in the galaxy, and from the moment Dorian stepped onto their ship, he realized they were nothing like the spoiled royal children he had imagined. The moment he met them, he could sense the sharp contrast between the two. Lysara, the older of the two by mere minutes, was calm, measured, and ever watchful. She spoke with a kind of authority that made others listen, even when she wasn't trying to command. Her sharp eyes always seemed to be calculating the next move, the next political play, as though she were playing a game of chess with the universe itself. Vena, on the other hand, was the wild card. Her laugh was louder, her steps bolder, and her smile more mischievous. Unlike her sister, who thought before acting, Vena was impulsive, often rushing into situations without a second thought. She enjoyed the thrill of danger and would push Dorian to the limit, testing his skills with her reckless stunts. But Dorian quickly learned that behind the playful grin, there was more to her than met the eye. Both sisters were far more than just pampered royals. They were deeply entwined in the political web of the Zarkari Empire, and their lives were constantly under threat from unseen enemies. As Dorian walked through the high-tech corridors of their ship, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The Zarkari were known for their intelligence, their advanced technology, and their ruthless nature, but they were also proud to the point of arrogance, and the way they looked at humans, like a species barely worth considering, made Dorian feel like a relic. It wasn't that he didn't know how to handle himself. He had survived countless assassination attempts before, but this wasn't just about him anymore. The job had become more personal. The sisters seemed to rely on him more and more, as though he were more than just a hired gun. He was their shield in a world where power meant everything. The first test came quicker than Dorian expected. As the royal vessel traveled through an uncharted sector, they were attacked by a group of unknown assailants. Without hesitation, Dorian dove into action. Using his quick reflexes and expert training, he took down the attackers one by one, his mind moving faster than his hands. The twins, watching from behind reinforced glass, couldn't hide their shock. They had never seen a bodyguard fight like this, efficient, ruthless, and without mercy. Dorian didn't flinch as the battle unfolded around him. He was in his element. When the final attacker fell, the ship was silent, save for the distant hum of the engines. After the attack, Lysara approached Dorian with her usual calm demeanor, her eyes studying him as if she were piecing together a puzzle. "Impressive," she said, her voice cool but tinged with something else, respect. It was hard to tell with her. Vena, on the other hand, grinned broadly and clapped him on the back, almost knocking him off balance. "That was amazing. I think we might have finally found a bodyguard who can keep up with us," she said, her voice full of energy. Dorian couldn't help but smile, though he was careful not to let his guard down. But there was more to this job than just protecting the twins from physical danger. It was becoming clear that Dorian had walked into a political hornet's nest, one that was far more dangerous than any mercenary job he had ever taken. The Zarkari were not just a species of warriors. They were schemers, playing a game of thrones that had lasted for centuries. And now, Dorian had become a player in that game, whether he liked it or not. Dorian had only been on the Zarkari homeworld for a few days, but already it felt like he was drowning in a sea of politics and power plays. The grand palace where he now served as the twins' bodyguard was a marvel of alien design. Towering spires, shimmering walls, and vast chambers that seemed to stretch on forever. But beneath the beauty of it all, Dorian could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. Everywhere he looked, there were eyes watching, subtle glances that betrayed the distrust and ambition that ran through the veins of the Zarkari elite. Everyone had an agenda, and none of them seemed particularly happy that a human had been brought into their midst. Princess Lysara, always calm and composed, was the one who kept her eyes on the bigger picture. She rarely spoke of their father, the High Chancellor, but Dorian could tell she was always thinking of the future. She was like a chess player, always calculating her next move. In every conversation, she appeared to be absorbing information, watching her advisors, listening to the whispers in the halls, and evaluating the loyalties of those around her. It wasn't lost on Dorian that she had the power to shape the Empire if given the right opportunity. But Lysara's sharp mind wasn't the only thing that made her dangerous. Her ability to manipulate those around her was just as impressive. Vena, on the other hand, was a firecracker. She thrived in chaos, often finding herself at the center of it, whether she intended to or not. She wasn't interested in the subtle games of diplomacy that Lysara played. Vena wanted action, excitement, and results. Quickly. It wasn't unusual for her to challenge her sister's plans, pushing for more direct approaches, even if they were reckless. And though Dorian knew she had a brilliant mind of her own, it was buried beneath layers of impulsive behavior. Still, he couldn't help but admire her confidence and the way she seemed to take everything in stride, as if nothing could touch her. It was the first night in the palace when Dorian realized just how serious the situation was. He was standing guard in a darkened corridor when an alarm blared through the entire complex. He moved instinctively, drawing his weapon and sprinting toward the source of the sound. It was coming from the royal quarters. As he neared the door, a loud explosion rocked the building. Dorian kicked the door open, and in the dim light, he saw the twins. Vena had a blaster in hand, her eyes wide with excitement, while Lysara stood behind her, coldly analyzing the situation. "Dorian," Vena called out, grinning like she had just won a victory. "We've got company." She fired a quick shot at a group of masked figures that had burst through the windows. It was the first time Dorian had seen her so at ease in the middle of chaos, and it made him wonder how many times she'd faced this kind of danger before. But it wasn't just Vena who was taking the fight to the enemy. Lysara's eyes locked onto Dorian's, and without a word, she motioned for him to join them. The two princesses fought side by side, moving with a grace and efficiency that spoke of training Dorian hadn't expected. He quickly realized that these weren't just royal daughters. They were dangerous in their own right. Their enemies were highly skilled, but with Dorian's help, they were forced to retreat, leaving only a trail of destruction in their wake. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but Dorian couldn't shake the feeling that this attack was only the beginning. The twins, for all their political maneuvering and charm, were in the middle of a deadly game they didn't fully understand. Whoever had sent these assassins wasn't just targeting the Zarkari royal family. They were targeting them. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Lysara and Vena weren't just pawns in this game. They were the prize, and the enemies who wanted them dead would stop at nothing to achieve their goal. Back in the aftermath of the fight, as Dorian checked for any remaining threats, Lysara approached him, her expression unreadable. "You did well," she said, her tone steady, "but this won't be the last time. You've been brought here for a reason, Dorian. Whether you like it or not, you are now part of our struggle." Vena, on the other hand, slapped him on the back, grinning widely. "You're a natural. I think we'll get along just fine." But Dorian knew this was more than just a fight for survival. It was a fight for power, and he was stuck in the middle of it. The twins had their own plans, but he wasn't sure if he could trust them completely. It was clear now. The world of the Zarkari was much darker, and far more dangerous, than he had ever imagined. And the longer he stayed, the more he realized there might be no way out. As days passed on the Zarkari homeworld, Dorian found himself trapped in a game far more dangerous than he ever imagined. He had signed up to be a bodyguard, to protect Princess Lysara and Princess Vena, but quickly realized his role was far more complex. The more he observed, the more he understood that this wasn't just about guarding two royal daughters. It was about navigating a deadly political web. The Zarkari Empire, one of the most powerful forces in the galaxy, was teetering on the edge of chaos. It was clear that the twins were more than just heirs to the throne. They were key players in a struggle for control, a battle that had been brewing for years. The palace was a fortress, a city in itself, but Dorian was beginning to feel like it was a prison. Every corridor and every room seemed to hold secrets, and every interaction was layered with hidden meanings. Lysara was no stranger to this world. Cold and calculating, she had been trained from a young age to wield power in silence, to read people and make moves before anyone realized she was playing. She moved through the palace with the grace of someone who had already decided her future. She rarely let her emotions show, but Dorian could tell that beneath her calm exterior, she was always thinking, always planning. The way she observed the nobility, the way she subtly moved chess pieces on the board, was both impressive and unnerving. She never once let her guard down, and neither did Dorian. She had learned long ago to trust no one, and she viewed him with a mix of curiosity and caution. Vena, however, was the opposite. Where Lysara was cold, Vena was fire. She was wild, impulsive, and unpredictable, qualities that made her a dangerous force in her own right. While Lysara played the game with her mind, Vena played it with her heart. She took risks, pushed boundaries, and thrived in chaos. In a way, she was everything that Lysara was not, but that made her no less dangerous. The moment Dorian thought he had her figured out, she would surprise him with some reckless decision or outlandish plan. She wore her emotions on her sleeve, but that only made her more unpredictable. The twins complemented each other in ways Dorian could never fully understand, but he was beginning to see how deeply entwined they were in the fate of the Zarkari Empire. The constant tension within the palace was hard to ignore. Every day, Dorian was exposed to new power struggles, whispered conversations in shadowy corners, and subtle threats hidden behind smiles. The nobility, the courtiers, and the generals all had their own ambitions, and the twins were at the center of it all. Dorian's role had quickly expanded beyond bodyguarding. He was no longer just protecting the twins from physical harm. He was now involved in their schemes, in their plans for the future of the Empire. It was clear that Lysara and Vena weren't just worried about assassination attempts. They were worried about betrayal, about the very foundations of their power being ripped from beneath them. One afternoon, while Dorian was standing guard in a lavish garden just outside the palace, Lysara approached him with a look of intensity in her eyes. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Dorian," she said, her voice low but firm, "there's a conspiracy within these walls. People who want us dead. People who want my father's throne for themselves." Dorian had known something like this was coming, but hearing it from Lysara's lips made it all too real. The Zarkari Empire wasn't just a monarchy. It was a powder keg waiting to explode. And the twins were sitting on top of it. Vena appeared moments later, her expression one of barely contained excitement. "You've got to be ready," she said, her grin wide. "The game's about to get a lot more interesting." She had no fear in her eyes, only the thrill of the challenge. Dorian didn't know if he should admire her boldness or be terrified by it. Either way, the stakes had just been raised, and he was more deeply involved than ever before. As the days went by, Dorian found himself drawn into the sisters' web of politics and deception. Every decision, every conversation, every meeting felt like it could be the spark that ignited a war for control of the Empire. The Zarkari, proud and powerful as they were, had deep cracks in their foundation, and those cracks were only widening. Dorian couldn't escape, even if he wanted to. He had become part of their game, a piece on their chessboard, and he knew that if he didn't play along, he might not survive the game. The longer he stayed, the more Dorian realized that this job wasn't just about keeping the princesses safe. It was about ensuring his own survival in a world where power was everything, and trust was a luxury few could afford. And as the conspiracy within the palace began to unfold, he understood one thing for sure. No one was safe. Not even the royal family. Dorian knew that things had gotten serious when Lizara finally took him aside in one of the palace's private chambers. The walls of the room were made of smooth, gleaming crystal, giving the space an otherworldly glow. Lizara's sharp, calculating eyes locked onto him as she spoke. "The time has come for you to understand why we chose you, Dorian. You're more than just a bodyguard now. You've been brought here to be our weapon." Her voice was calm, but there was an intensity in her words that sent a chill down his spine. Dorian's first instinct was to refuse, to walk away from this tangled web of power and politics, but he knew he couldn't. The more he learned, the more he realized that the Zarkari Empire was on the brink of collapse, and the twins were at the very center of a deadly game. If he left, he might be branded an enemy or worse, become a target. So, reluctantly, he agreed to listen. Lizara continued, "There are factions within the court, old, powerful families, who believe my father is weak. They want to overthrow him, and by extension, us. They've already tried to kill us once, but we have a secret weapon of our own. You. You may be human, but you understand the art of war in a way they can't even imagine. You've been in the fire, Dorian. You know how to survive when the odds are stacked against you." Dorian wasn't sure whether to feel insulted or honored by her words. He was used to being seen as a tool, as something disposable in the eyes of his employers. But there was something different about the way Lizara spoke to him, something that made him feel like he mattered, even in the midst of all the chaos. "I'm not a politician," Dorian said, his voice low. "I don't care about your empire's power struggles. I just want to survive. If I'm going to help you, you need to understand something. I'm not your knight in shining armor. I'm a mercenary. I do what I'm paid for." Lizara didn't flinch at his words. "I understand that, Dorian, but this isn't about money. This is about survival. And if you don't help us, you'll find out just how dangerous the enemies we face truly are." Before Dorian could respond, Vena burst into the room, her energy like a storm. She wasn't the calculating type like Lizara. She thrived on action, on moving fast. "You're not seriously thinking about leaving, are you?" she said, grinning. "We need you. You're the only one who can keep up with us. And honestly, I think it'd be kind of boring without you around." Dorian glanced at Lizara, who gave him a look that was almost imperceptible, but there was no mistaking the seriousness behind it. The twins had made it clear. He wasn't just a hired gun anymore. He was an essential part of their plans, whether he liked it or not. But Dorian wasn't sure if he could trust them completely. There was something about the way they spoke, the way they looked at him, that made him uneasy. They were royal, raised to manipulate people, to get what they wanted no matter the cost. He had seen enough of that in his time as a mercenary to recognize it when it was right in front of him. The twins were no different from the other powerful people he had crossed paths with. They just had more at stake. Later that night, Dorian stood at his usual post, staring out at the city from a balcony high above the palace. The lights of the city sparkled like stars, but beneath the beauty of the view, he felt a growing sense of dread. He was in too deep now. There was no going back. Vena found him there, as she often did, her footsteps light but confident. "You're thinking too much," she said, leaning against the stone railing. "Just trust us. We'll take care of the rest. You're with us now, Dorian, and we always look out for our own." Her words were comforting, but they didn't ease the storm inside him. He was still a stranger in a strange world, still trying to figure out what game the sisters were really playing. The more he saw of their world, the more he realized just how high the stakes were. "You don't know what you're asking me to do," Dorian replied, his voice quiet. "But I'll stick around. For now, I'll help you survive." Vena smiled, her expression one of triumph. "That's all we need from you. For now, anyway." As she left, Dorian couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The game they were playing wasn't just about survival, it was about power, and the only way to win it was to take everything. He was no longer just a bodyguard. He was a pawn in a game where everyone had something to lose. And the twins, for all their charm and beauty, were just as dangerous as the enemies who sought their downfall. The question wasn't whether he would survive. He had done that before. The question was whether he could trust them, or whether he would become just another casualty of their ambition. The days grew more tense as Dorian found himself deeper in the web of intrigue surrounding the Zarkari royal family. He had always been a man of action, someone who relied on his instincts and experience, but the political games played by Princess Lysara and Princess Vena were a different kind of battlefield. He could no longer rely on just his combat skills to navigate this treacherous world. He had to learn to read people, to understand motivations, and to anticipate moves long before they happened. But the more he observed, the more he realized that Lysara and Vena weren't just playing for control of the Empire. They were playing for their very survival. One evening, after another failed assassination attempt that left Dorian shaken but alive, Lysara called him to a secluded room in the palace. The dimly lit space was cold and sterile, a sharp contrast to the opulence of the rest of the palace. She was sitting at a long table, studying a series of holographic displays, her fingers moving with precision as she navigated through layers of information. As soon as Dorian entered, she turned to face him, her expression as unreadable as ever. "You did well today," Lysara said, her voice calm and controlled. "But there's something you need to understand. The attacks on us aren't random. There's a group of high-ranking officials, generals, and nobles working against us. They want to see us fall, and they'll stop at nothing to make it happen." Her eyes locked onto his, as if she was daring him to question her. Dorian crossed his arms, staring at her with suspicion. "You think this is just about power? About your father's throne?" He had seen his fair share of coups and betrayals in his time, but something about Lysara's words made him uneasy. There was a depth to her plans, something that went beyond the typical political maneuvering. Lysara didn't flinch at his challenge. "It's not just about the throne, Dorian. It's about control. The Zarkari Empire has been on the brink of collapse for years. My father's reign is failing, and people are starting to realize that. They see us, me and Vena, as weaknesses, as the last chance to seize power before everything falls apart." Dorian's mind raced. He had always thought of the Zarkari as a powerful, unshakable empire, but now he was seeing the cracks beneath the surface. The more he learned, the more he realized just how dangerous this world was. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined, and the twins were caught right in the middle of it all. As if on cue, Princess Vena barged into the room, her usual energy spilling over into the otherwise tense atmosphere. "What's all this talk about falling apart? We're still in charge here, aren't we?" She flashed a grin, but Dorian could see the uncertainty behind her eyes. Despite her bold front, she was clearly aware of the danger they were in. Lysara didn't smile back. "We're not in charge of anything yet. The real question is whether we can take control before it's too late." Her voice was soft, but there was a hardness beneath it, a warning that Dorian knew all too well. She was playing a game of high stakes, one where failure meant not just losing power, it meant losing everything. Dorian's role had shifted once again. He wasn't just a bodyguard or a pawn. He was now a part of their strategy, someone who could help them navigate the dangers they faced. But as much as he wanted to trust Lysara and Vena, something in the pit of his stomach told him that they were hiding more than they were letting on. He had seen how they manipulated those around them, how they used their charm and intelligence to get what they wanted. And while he admired their strength, he couldn't help but wonder if they were playing him just as much as they were playing everyone else. Vena leaned in, her grin widening as she addressed Dorian. "We need you more than ever. The next few days are critical. We got to make some moves before our enemies can strike again, and I have a feeling you're just the kind of person who can make that happen." Dorian didn't know whether to feel honored or nervous. His survival instincts kicked in, telling him that it was too late to back out now. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had already crossed a line he couldn't uncross. That night, as Dorian stood guard outside the royal chambers, his mind raced. The more he learned, the more dangerous it all became. The Zarkari were powerful, but they were fractured, ripe for someone to come along and take what they had built. He had been trained to fight, to survive, but now he had to learn to outthink his enemies, to play the game of power, or he might become just another casualty in a war he hadn't signed up for. He wasn't sure who to trust anymore, but one thing was clear: if he wanted to survive, he had to stick with Lysara and Vena. For better or worse, they were his only allies in a world that wanted to see them all fall. The palace had never felt so alive with tension as it did now. Every corner, every shadow seemed to whisper with secrets and danger. Dorian walked the halls, his senses on high alert. For weeks, he had been living in a world where alliances shifted faster than he could keep up. Every moment felt like a tightrope walk, where one wrong move could send him plummeting into the abyss. His bodyguard duties had evolved into something far more complex. He wasn't just protecting Princess Lysara and Princess Vena anymore. He was deeply involved in their survival, in their fight for control of the Zarkari Empire. And it was becoming clear that if he wasn't careful, he might be dragged into something much darker than he ever anticipated. That night, Lysara summoned him to her private study. The room was dimly lit, filled with maps and holographic projections of the Empire's key regions. The air felt heavy with the weight of the decisions being made in that room. Lysara was sitting at the table, eyes focused on the projections in front of her. Her expression was sharp, her focus absolute. She didn't look up as Dorian entered, but her voice was steady as she spoke. "We have a problem," she said, her tone cold. "The rebellion is gaining traction. The factions within the Empire that have been quietly plotting against us are no longer staying in the shadows. They're moving openly. We need to act before they gain too much power." Dorian's gut tightened. He had known something like this was coming. The Empire, once so powerful and unyielding, was cracking at the seams. The assassination attempts, the whispers in the corridors, the cold looks from trusted allies. It all pointed to a brewing storm, and Lysara, with her calculating mind, was already preparing for it. "I assume you have a plan?" Dorian asked, leaning against the doorframe, his voice steady, but with a hint of concern. Lysara finally met his gaze. "Of course, but it involves more than just military strength. We need to win the loyalty of the people, the soldiers, the generals who are still on the fence. And to do that, we need leverage. We need a show of force." The weight of her words sank in. This wasn't just a political struggle. It was a war for survival. A war that would decide the fate of the entire empire. And Dorian, a simple mercenary turned bodyguard, was now right in the middle of it all. He had been trained to fight wars, to survive in the chaos of battle. But this was different. This was a war of minds, of manipulation, of subtle moves that could change everything in an instant. Before Dorian could respond, Vena stormed into the room, her energy as intense as ever. "I'm not waiting around for some fancy plan," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. "We need to hit them hard, fast. Strike first, and let them know we're not afraid." She moved to stand beside Lysara, her fiery presence contrasting sharply with her sister's cold demeanor. Lysara gave Vena a sharp look, but there was a glint of approval in her eyes. "I don't disagree, but we need to be careful. If we make the wrong move, we risk everything. We can't afford to show weakness." Vena rolled her eyes, clearly impatient. "Weakness? You think they'll respect us if we sit back and do nothing? We got to show them that we're in control." Dorian stood in silence, watching the sisters. He had seen their differences before, but this time the divide between them felt more pronounced. Lysara, always thinking 10 steps ahead, wanted to play the long game. Vena, impulsive and bold, wanted to act now, take control immediately. It was a dangerous combination, but also one that could work if they could find a balance. "I think we need to find a middle ground," Dorian said, his voice cutting through the tension. "You're both right, but rushing in without a plan could destroy everything. We need to move, but we need to move smart." Lizara considered his words for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. We'll take a more calculated approach, but we can't afford to hesitate any longer." Vena seemed satisfied with that answer. "Finally, let's get to work." Dorian couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. The game they were playing wasn't just a matter of strategy. It was a game of life and death. As much as he had come to admire the twins, he couldn't ignore the danger they posed. Power had a way of corrupting people, and Lizara and Vena were no exception. As Dorian left the study, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. He had already made his choice, to stay and fight by their side. But every step he took felt like a step deeper into a world he could never escape from. The fate of the Zarkari Empire hung in the balance, and whether he liked it or not, he was now a part of it. The question was no longer whether he would survive. It was whether he could live with the choices he was about to make. The tension in the palace had reached a boiling point. Every hallway seemed to whisper with the secrets of betrayal and shifting loyalties. Dorian could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, but he knew there was no turning back now. He had made his choice. He would stand by Princess Lizara and Princess Vena, no matter what it cost him. The rebellion was gaining momentum, and the sisters' empire was hanging by a thread. One wrong move, and it could all come crashing down. It was early morning when Lizara called him into her private strategy room. The large chamber was quiet, save for the soft hum of the holographic displays. Lizara stood before a map of the empire, her brow furrowed in concentration as she studied the various factions that threatened their rule. She looked up as Dorian entered, her eyes cold but focused. "We need to act now. We've lost too much ground already. The generals who are loyal to us are scattered, and the rebels are growing bolder by the day." Dorian stepped forward, his instincts kicking in. "What do you need me to do?" Lizara turned towards him, her gaze piercing. "We need to send a clear message to the Empire. The rebellion thinks we're weak, that we can be overthrown. We'll show them how wrong they are." Her voice was steady, but there was a fire burning beneath the surface. Dorian had seen this side of her before, the side that was willing to do whatever it took to hold on to power. Before Dorian could respond, Princess Vena barged into the room, her presence like a storm. "I say we take them head on. No more games. We strike hard, we strike fast." She grinned, clearly eager for action. Her eyes glinted with excitement, but Dorian knew that her impulsive nature could be as much a weakness as a strength. They couldn't afford mistakes. Not now. Lizara narrowed her eyes at Vena, her calm demeanor never wavering. "You want to strike, but do you understand the consequences? A reckless move could send us into a full-scale war. That's what they want. They want us to make a mistake. If we rush in blindly, we'll fall right into their trap." Vena didn't back down, her voice rising with determination. "And if we wait too long, we'll lose everything. We can't just sit around while they gather strength. We have to act now." Dorian could see the tension between the sisters, the difference in their approaches. Lizara was all about control, calculating every move, while Vena was ready to take risks, to strike at the heart of their enemies without hesitation. He knew both of them had valid points, but they couldn't afford to waste time fighting each other. The rebellion was closing in, and if they didn't unite, they would be torn apart. "We need to find a middle ground," Dorian said, his voice calm but firm. The sisters both turned to him, and he felt their eyes on him. Lizara's calculating, Vena's fiery. "I've been in battles where you don't have the luxury of time, but rushing in without preparation is just as dangerous. We need to move fast, but we need to be smart about it. We strike at their weak points, hard and fast, but we do it with precision. Lizara studied him for a moment, her sharp mind evaluating his words. Finally, she nodded. You're right. We can't afford to hesitate, but we also can't afford to be reckless. We'll move quickly, but with purpose. Vena crossed her arms, clearly still eager for action, but she seemed to understand. Fine. We hit them where it hurts, but we make sure they know who's in charge. Dorian felt a strange sense of relief. He had been thrown into this battle without a choice, and now, for the first time, it felt like the sisters were finally on the same page. They had their differences, but when it came down to it, they both knew what needed to be done. They were in this together, at least for now. As the three of them stood there, planning their next move, Dorian couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a razor-thin line between success and destruction. The Empire was fragile, and every decision they made from this point forward would carry consequences. But Dorian was no stranger to danger. He had survived far worse, and if he had to fight by their side, he would do so with everything he had. Lizara, Vena, and Dorian, three unlikely allies in a fight for survival. The path ahead was uncertain, and the stakes were higher than ever. But in that moment, Dorian knew one thing for sure. The game had changed, and there was no turning back. The days that followed were a blur of rapid decisions, tense meetings, and whispered strategies. Dorian had been thrust into a whirlwind of palace intrigue, and he was learning quickly that the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. Every move mattered. Every word spoken could shift the balance of power in the Empire. The rebellion was growing, and the Zarkari royal family was running out of time. Lizara, Vena, and Dorian had agreed on a plan, but the weight of that plan was now pressing down on them. There was no turning back. Dorian had spent years honing his combat skills, but now he was being asked to think like a strategist, to be more than just a bodyguard. It was a challenge, but he was determined to rise to it. Lizara and Vena were smart, each in her own way, but they didn't have the experience in battle that Dorian did. He had seen wars and betrayals, watched empires rise and fall. Now his knowledge was going to be put to the test. Lizara had spent the last few days meeting with generals and diplomats, securing their loyalty and preparing for the inevitable clash with the rebellion. Vena, on the other hand, had been organizing covert operations, ensuring that their forces were ready to strike when the time came. Both sisters were working tirelessly, each with her own strengths, but there was a growing sense of urgency. The rebellion was closing in, and they had to make their move before it was too late. One evening, Lizara called Dorian into her private quarters, the tension in her voice unmistakable. "It's time," she said. "The rebellion is planning something big. We've gathered intelligence that they're moving on the capital. We have one chance to stop them. If we fail, everything we've worked for will be lost." Dorian's heart sank. The capital was the heart of the Empire, its symbol of power and strength. If the rebels took it, they would shatter the Zarkari's grip on the galaxy. He couldn't allow that to happen. "What's the plan?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. Lizara looked at him with a calculated expression. "We'll strike at their supply lines, cripple their ability to fight. We'll hit them where it hurts. The rebellion is scattered, but if we can disrupt their supply chains, we'll force them to retreat. We'll take the fight to them before they can reach the capital." Dorian nodded. It was a sound strategy. Strike hard, strike fast, and cripple their enemy's ability to fight back. But there was one thing that still bothered him. He wasn't sure if it would be enough. The rebellion had more support than they realized. If they underestimated their enemies, they could find themselves trapped. Vena walked into the room just then, her energy infectious. "It's about time we put this plan into motion. I'm ready for action," she said with a smile, clearly eager to get started. Lizara glanced at her sister, then back at Dorian. "We can't afford to be reckless. The rebels have grown stronger. We must act with precision." Vena threw up her hands, clearly frustrated. I know. But we've waited long enough. We can't sit back and let them take the capital. We got to show them we're in control." Dorian stepped in, trying to balance the two conflicting approaches. "I agree with both of you. We need to move fast, but we can't afford to be careless. Lysara's plan is solid, but we need to make sure we don't leave any gaps. The rebels will be expecting us to strike. If we don't keep them guessing, they'll counter our move." Lysara considered his words carefully, then nodded. "We'll modify the plan. We'll move quickly, but we'll keep them on their toes. We'll strike at their supply lines, but we'll also set up distractions, confuse them, and make them believe we're going in a different direction. That way, we can strike when they least expect it." Vayna grinned. "Now that's more like it. Let's show them what the Zarkari are capable of." The sisters' plan was set in motion, and Dorian could feel the weight of it all bearing down on him. The rebellion was closing in, and this was their last chance to prevent disaster. The tension was palpable as the royal army gathered, ready to strike. Dorian felt the familiar adrenaline surge through his veins. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving that the Zarkari still had power, that they weren't going to go down without a fight. As the night drew closer, Dorian found himself reflecting on the path that had led him here. He had never intended to become entangled in the Zarkari's power struggle. He had never planned on becoming more than a hired sword. But now he was part of something much bigger. He had a choice to make: fight and survive, or risk everything for the hope of a better future. He didn't know what the outcome would be, but one thing was certain: the time for waiting was over. The battle for the Zarkari Empire was about to begin. The day of reckoning had arrived. Dorian stood at the edge of the royal war room, his eyes scanning the holographic displays showing the movements of both their forces and the rebels. The plan was in motion, and every moment counted. Tension hung in the air like a thick fog. The Empire was on the brink, and it all rested on their shoulders. Princess Lysara, Princess Vayna, and Dorian. The final battle for control of the Empire was now, and failure was not an option. Lysara's voice was steady as she gave the final orders, but there was a fire in her eyes. "We move at dawn. Strike fast, hit their supply lines, and make sure they can't regroup. We can't let them reach the capital." Vayna stood beside her sister, her energy contagious. "We'll show them who's in charge. They think they can tear this empire apart, but they don't know us. Not yet." Dorian couldn't shake the unease that lingered in his chest. It wasn't just the battle that bothered him. He knew the stakes. If they failed, the rebellion would claim victory, and the Zarkari Empire would fall. But there was something more. The sisters had grown closer, and yet he knew the fragile balance between them could shatter at any moment. Their conflicting personalities were always present, and though they'd managed to work together, the price of failure could change everything. Their loyalty to each other would be tested in ways they couldn't yet predict. As dawn broke, Dorian joined the two sisters on the front lines. The army was ready, armed, and prepared for the fight ahead. The rebellion, though strong, was scattered, and their strength lay in their numbers. But Dorian believed in their plan. They would strike quickly and with precision. If they could disable the enemy's supply lines, they could sever the rebellion's ability to fight back. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the best shot they had. They rode out under the cover of darkness, the moonlight barely cutting through the thick clouds above. Dorian was at the front of the group, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. He felt the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him, not just as a bodyguard, but as someone who had grown to care deeply for the two sisters. They had become more than just a mission to him. They were his allies, and he would protect them at all costs. The sound of the army's march was deafening as they approached the rebel supply lines. Dorian's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with calculations. They had to time this perfectly. One misstep, and the rebellion would catch on, and they would be ready for them. But they couldn't wait any longer. The attack had to be decisive. As they reached their target, Dorian could see the flicker of movement in the distance. Rebels were positioned, unaware of the royal army's approach. A quick glance at Lizara confirmed her readiness, and she nodded to him. Without hesitation, Dorian led the charge, his blade drawn. The battle erupted in an instant, the crack of weapons clashing in the night air. It was chaos, but it was controlled chaos, exactly as planned. Lizara and Vena fought fiercely beside him, their combined power a sight to behold. Vena's boldness was a perfect match for Lizara's calculated strategy. Together, they cut through the enemy lines with ruthless precision, taking out key leaders, cutting off their escape routes, and disabling their weapons and supplies. As the battle raged on, Dorian found himself caught in the center of it, the heat of the moment making everything feel surreal. He fought with everything he had, his sword moving almost of its own accord, driven by the adrenaline and the weight of the moment. The rebel forces were strong, but they were scattered and disorganized. Every move they made played into the royal family's hands. By the time the sun began to rise, the rebels were in full retreat. The royal army had decimated their supply lines, leaving them with no resources to continue the fight. The rebellion, though not defeated entirely, had suffered a crushing blow. Dorian stood in the midst of the battlefield, breathless and covered in the dirt and sweat of battle. The fight had been brutal, but they had won. For now, the Zarkari Empire was safe. As the dust settled, Lizara and Vena approached him, their expressions both triumphant and wary. The battle was over, but the war was far from finished. Lizara's voice broke through his thoughts. "We're not done yet, Dorian. The rebellion won't give up easily, but today we've sent them a message." Vena grinned, her eyes alight with the thrill of victory. "And we're just getting started." Dorian nodded, feeling the weight of the journey ahead. He had chosen this path, and there was no turning back. He wasn't just fighting for the Zarkari Empire anymore. He was fighting for the future of the sisters, for the future of everything they had built. And no matter what came next, he would stand with them until the very end.